Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 185. Today we're talking about Houdini and CSS painting things, and we're going to paint some just lovely trees, Bob Ross style today. We are your hosts this week, Justin Brow, Leon Revel, Amal Hussein. Amal, welcome back. It's been a long time.
I know, I've been on a hiatus. I'm so happy to be back.
And we are happy to have you. Leon, you've also been generally on vacation. Welcome back, Leon.
Thank you. It's great to be back and great to see Mel back as well.
I know. Sometimes I think it's just Danny and I or Eric just sitting around talking about the platform. But today, we're going to talk about all kinds of interesting platform things and have some more of the original cast back. But before we get to that, we're going to throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thank you, Justin. So first of all, there's been a really nice accessibility guide, which has been published to GitHub. There's loads of great content there in a really, really nice format, so go and check it out. Adi Osmani just published an article which talks about how Chrome is experimenting with back and forward cache, which could improve performance by 19%, so that looks very exciting, so go and check that out as well. There's an ESLint plugin for web components, which has just been published on GitHub, and this adds some specific linting rules around web component best practices, which is really great to see. It'd be really good to see that kind of growing as more best practices arise as well. And finally, Ionic has just published a blog post which is announcing their Ionic React beta, which is really good to see as well. So still lots of stuff happening on the web, and that's everything from me for This Week in Web. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. Some interesting things happening on the platform this week as we find ourselves. I can't believe it's almost the end of February. It is the end of February. This is it. This is all February's wrote. I don't know what happened to the first 2 months out of the year. I feel like we've all just been writing a lot of code. And speaking of writing a lot of code, it's time to introduce our guest this week. You know him from Supercharged on YouTube. You know him from writing examples that will literally blow your mind on all things Houdini and WebAssembly and all the good things the platform offers. Surma, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
So, Surma, for folks out there who don't know you, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Soma. I work as a open web developer advocate for Google in London. And I have, over the last couple of years, kind of grabbed a couple of topics for myself. Most notably, probably Houdini, which I have been working on and working with now for, 2 years or something. Like, been basically started joining the standards group when it just started out, and try to help shape APIs so that developers can understand them. And that has kind of led me down the web performance rabbit hole, and I've learned to love it and feel very much at home there. So all the things I do are basically building apps and showing that you can do pretty extraordinary stuff on the web without having to download massive files or have horrible performance. And that's kind of my daily job, really.
Web performance is just an interesting topic. We talk about web performance on the show quite a bit. And I'm curious, though, how did you get started on the web? Everyone's got an origin story of things. Like, where were you when you started the web in the massive world of all things code and things?
So my story is actually really, really boring and kind of sad. I lived in Berlin, and I got an email from a recruiter at Google if I didn't want to apply. And I was mostly doing back-end development. I was the organizer of the GDG user group for Golang in Berlin and was a GDE expert for Golang. And so I was like, oh, cool, I can make Go my day job. Like, yeah, I'm going to apply and see how far I get. And I didn't expect to go through, but apparently I did. And so I got the job offer and I did it, and I joined my team, and they were like, well, we don't have Go. You can choose. Do you want to do Android or web? And I had no experience in either, really. And I was like, well, I had built a website for my own company way back when, and it was horrible. And now that I look at it, but I was like, I know a little bit of web, and it's kind of like cool that it's on so many devices. I'm gonna do some web. And so since then, I've been just learning from all the people around me, because that's really the perk of this job, that I sit next to all these people who know everything. You know, I've got Jake Archibald and Paul Lewis and Adi Osmani, all my team, who are just not only just there, but also very willing to help. And so I've been just soaking up everything that they will give me and teach me. And that's how I started web, because I had to choose.
I think you made the right choice. I'm biased, obviously. You know.
Yeah,
as
no
someone
regrets from my end.
Yeah, I love the I guess I could do web. I guess it's this thing that's on all platforms, all devices. The greatest humanity, invention humanity's ever made. Sure, I could work on that. That was great. Also, I don't know if anybody else caught the pun. Like, you were like, I guess I could give it a go. Was that intentional?
Yes, but it was subtle
really,
for the connoisseurs in the audience.
Pun received, my friend. That was well done. Let's see how many Go puns we can fit into today.
I feel bad about the story, because then sometimes I talk to Jake and he's like, well, back in the day when I was doing Flash, and I was like, oh, I never did that. And then back in the day when IE4 and Safari 1, I was like, what? Sure. So I have skipped a lot of the really awful phase of the web, and just came in when the web was just a bit awful still, and have now experienced the final kind of last couple of years where it really has improved quite a bit from where I started. So I can't even quite relate to how the people feel who started like a decade ago and did the whole IE6 era and whatnot. So hats off to all those people who stuck around and lived through that kind of bit of the history.
Yeah, well, I work at Boku, and I like half my team has been contributing to the web since I was I don't know, maybe in middle school or something like that. My team lead Corey Frang is wrote a good chunk of jQuery. I just so it's just as you're in good company.
It can be very intimidating. Chris Wilson, who just recently left the team, but he was implemented CSS in the first browser Mosaic, and I'm like, okay then. So it's these kind of people that is super interesting to talk to for me, because they have so much more insight than I do.
Yeah. So speaking of insight, I guess before we get into Houdini, I guess what standards body, can you tell folks what standards body the work for Houdini is being done under? Is this W3C, WhatWig, CSS working group? I guess can you what's the lay of the land there?
So standards are complicated, I have learned over the years. Technically, it's kind of in the name. So the Houdini task force, the actual group that standardizes and works on Houdini, is part of the CSS working group. So it is part of CSS, which makes sense, because the slogan of Houdini is to expose the CSS machinery of the browser to the developer. So you get all the little bits and pieces from under the hood, and you can now use them in more powerful ways. That being said, each individual standard that comes out of the working group, or each individual idea that the standard group comes up with, goes the traditional path, usually at least, of going through the YCG, the Web Incubator Community Group, I think it stands for, where it basically is just pitched as a completely new and innocent proposal, and people can take a look at it, and then browsers can restate their interest or no interest in that proposal. Then it will get fleshed out as a proper standards text and standards document, and then usually it gets adopted into the CSS working group as a standard that the CSS working groups works on. I think technically it could also certain specs could end up in a different working group, but that hasn't happened yet with the Houdini task force. So it's a group of people who really want to expose these underlying mechanisms. Then they come up with ideas and approaches to these different problems, run them through the YCG, and then it gets adopted by the CSS working group, which is technically a bigger group of people who will then make sure that the API design and the approach to the entire thing is consistent with CSS and works across browsers and all the things that are involved in making a standard.
So I know that how did you end up getting roped into this? How was this your choice? You're like, you know what? I like difficult things. Standards seem easy enough. I can swing this. I've written stuff. Like, why Houdini? Why CSS? Because CSS sort of gets a bad rap out there as being, something that people often shrew, which
careful what
makes
you
me
say.
sad. Like, it
You're
makes me
gonna
genuinely
get
sad.
tweeted at. It's again a really boring story. So on the one hand, when I joined, Jake basically was just about to not finish, but have the first major version of the service worker standard kind of approved by the W3C, I think. And I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. I would like to know more about this. And so I talked a bit to Jake, like how it works and how this whole cross-browser thing works. Because from the outside, to me, as a just new web developer, like I thought, browsers are competitors, like they're in the same room and talk to each other. What's going on there? I found it quite interesting. And then on the same time, Paul Lewis was asked to help out with Houdini because he is obviously very good at doing UIs and special effects, the kind of things that Houdini would use, but he had too much on his plate doing Lighthouse already at the time. And so he kind of forwarded it to me because he knew that I also can do UIs and have some experience in that sector. And so Ian Kilpatrick, who is our lead on Houdini in the Chrome organization, just had a meeting with me. Was like, you should book a flight to Sydney. You should come to the meeting. And that's how I ended up at the first CSS working group meeting. And I was 100% overwhelmed. I had no idea what's happening. I remember at the start in the CSS working group, we usually do a round of a quick introduction where you just say your name, your organization, and you type that into the chat as well. So everybody knows where everybody sits and can look it up in chat if they need to. Cool. And I remember that I was like the second or third person in the round. And so I didn't quite pick up on the pattern. So I remember like explaining, so, hi, I'm Surma and I do like Chrome dev role. I'm pretty new, but I would like to see what's going on. And, I'm doing like web stuff. And I explained my entire life story to them, not realizing that nobody cared. So that was my first standards experience. But that's how I ended up there. Basically, Paul Lewis pitched it over to me because he was too busy. That's the short version.
So I guess how like, I guess getting back to Houdini, I guess, can you kind of talk a little bit more about like what the motivations were behind the project, a role behind this kind of new initiative and empowering kind of extended primitives, in the CSS world. We saw some of that in HTML rendering, right, with web components kind of being this extensible web primitive, and so it felt like doing that for CSS was infinitely more complicated for browser engineers. But I guess I'll let you talk about that.
I think the keyword is in there. You just said it's the extensible web. We need more low-level primitives on the web so that developers can actually build the higher level concepts that they need and make the platform more moldable, more shapeable by you, by what you actually want to build. There's just a couple of things on the web that are so high level and they are kind of overfit to one specific use case. And when you want to go do something else that is in a similar vein, you're kind of bending over backwards. And so that's the Extensible Web manifesto, where it's like, we want more low-level primitives on the web, put those out, and then observe what developers do, and then maybe we can add a couple of high-level primitives for performance reasons or for convenience reasons, once we have seen that that is actually a popular use case. And Houdini is exactly that effort for CSS. So most, if not all, browsers have these 4 stages when they consume CSS. They have the style parsing stage, where they consume your CSS style sheets and they parse them and they turn them into actual data structures under the hood. They have the layout phase, where they consult the styles to lay out the individual elements where they are on the document and on the screen. Then they have the paint stage, where they fill in these regions for the elements with actual pixel colors and things. And then we have the compositing stage, where these individual elements are then composed into one big image that you see on your screen as the website. And each of these stages is completely, or not completely, but to the most extent, inaccessible to you as a web developer. You have a couple of things that you can do with CSS, like, will change to turn something into a layer. You can obviously change the text color with the color attribute. But then suddenly you're like, okay, cool, I have a border on my box, but I kind of want the border to be dashed, and I would like to have really minute control over where these dashes are and how they meet at the corners. now you're suddenly screwed. And that's where Houdini comes in and gives you really the low-level primitives. So with Paint, you can actually decide where each individual pixel is painted and how it is painted and in which color. And with Layout, you can decide what a width of 200% actually means, because in your own layout, that could mean something completely different to what it means in the standard block layout. And so all these individual stages that the browser has are now exposed to you with different standards from Houdini, that you can change the browser's behavior to how you want it to be without having to do everything in JavaScript land and on the main thread and making your website incredibly slow.
Do developers understand this sort of chain of things that gets us to that sort of composite state? I sometimes struggle with sort of explaining the performance benefits, because the question comes up, well, why would I necessarily want to control certain parts of this question? Is it just so that I can have more control over my UI? But there are performance benefits to a lot of this that kind of surfaces, but I'm not 100% sure developers quite grasp. Do we have sort of the notion to sort of start to explain these things better to developers?
I mean, that's kind of the necessity. Once we put these APIs out there, then we kind of explain why they exist and how to use them. So with animation worklet, for example, it's pretty challenging because, or actually with Paint, it was more challenging because you look at it and it sounds like, okay, so it's a canvas. What's the point?
Right.
And then the more you look into it, or hopefully the more I explain in my articles, you kind of realize that is a very small handful of differences between a normal canvas and what CSS Paint is doing that makes a massive difference in developer convenience and performance in the end. So as I said, like, for example, Paint gives you the ability to make your own border shapes, something that previously was only possible with border images and could become quite tedious. With animation worklet, you have more control over animating different objects and building your own easing functions and building your own transitions between pages. You had kind of CSS animations API, but it's never been really greatly supported, and also was it was declarative and not really flexible to do really complex stuff when you wanted to run some animations with JavaScript and some don't. So yeah, we definitely need to do a lot of explaining here to actually make developers understand why these APIs have been made and how to use them. Absolutely.
Yeah, the animations API, it's a shame. Like, I had high hopes for the animations API, but it never quite, I mean, it's useful in certain cases, like you said, but it's never quite hit all the notes.
Well, the thing is that the spec is actually really good. It's like a proper GreenSock. Everything that you would want from that you take from GreenSock is actually in there, but no browser has actually implemented the entire spec. And I'm still not quite sure why that is. So some browsers don't have it at all. I know that we have a partial implementation. I know that Safari shipped an implementation, or at least it's in the tech preview now. So I feel like for some reason, after some dead time on the spec, it's now coming back to life. But even then, there is a certain point where the capabilities of the animations API are not enough to do the things that you want to do. So for example, the classic example that we bring is scroll-linked animations. So what the Houdini Animation Worklet API did is basically introduce a new timeline, because CSS Animations API had the concept of a timeline, but only had one timeline, which is the document timeline. So just normal time. And after 1 second, 1 second has elapsed. With a scroll timeline, you can now go forwards and backwards in time by scrolling your document, allowing you to do scroll-linked effects. So we have these things which, you see them actually quite often nowadays, that you have a product preview on the screen. When you scroll down, it kind of like turns around while you scroll. That's a scroll-linked effect, because the effect is linked to scrolling. And previously, that was done by listening to the scroll event and then changing the element on screen. And that can be super janky or make it very low fidelity and feel kind of sluggish. And with animation worklet, it will now be frame perfect. And not only that, but it will run on the compositor thread, or at least not on the main thread, leaving your main thread budget open to actually be responsive to user input. So there's all these little benefits that make your experience so much more high fidelity and so much more robust to low-end device constraints, that hopefully these bunch of APIs will not only help you make better effects without having to write awful code, but also help you make the same effects happen on lower-end devices, which is, I think, a really important point nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought up a really great example, because ultimately it's really about leveraging the platform as much as possible, right? And like limiting the amount of overhead, that you have as a developer have to ship, right? It's a great example of that is, CSS Grid versus Bootstrap Grid, right? Being able to just leverage the platform natively just means that, there's less bloat, and it's also much, much more performant, right? Because you're not having to do all these funky dances in your code or in your CSS to be able to handle for that, gracefully, right? So I guess with that in mind, are there like specific, I guess, is there more of a specific kind of initiative around performance with Houdini? Like, I'm curious if there's is that the kind of primary driver behind the spec creation, or is it kind of performance plus extensibility?
Yeah, I think it's definitely those two tracks. On the one hand, performance is definitely one of the goals of Houdini. So there's a reason why we ship paint worklet, and now the next big thing on the to-do list is to move that code that does the painting to a different thread, because you don't need that to run on the main thread. On the other hand, the capabilities that Houdini brings to the web are actually just as important, because there has been this gap between, I'm going to bring up the old native versus web example, even though I don't like doing it anymore, but there was just a certain group of effects and a certain group of behaviors that people got used to through native apps that just felt really nice in how to use or navigate an app, that were incredibly hard, if not impossible, to do on the web. So one simple example was just like having a panel that you can swipe through vertically with like different menus. I think the Twitter app used to do that. It was possible, sure, but it was incredibly hard to do it in a performant way that actually felt good. Or doing a good pull to refresh implementation. You kind of had to work against the browser implementation and then kind of put your own on top. And all these things that are missing are hopefully what Houdini will allow you to do without having to bend over backwards. So the kind of like the panel scrolling that I mentioned is already a lot easier through animation worklet and also through more high-level things like CSS snap points. Pull to refresh, I don't know if we have looked into this recently. It's always been one of the use cases we wanted to solve, but I don't think we have figured it out yet. A good hero transition is like the classic example that I still think is hard nowadays, and I'm still kind of looking how Houdini will help solve this. I think it will, but I haven't written an example yet and haven't quite figured out. So it's a thing where you have a button, like you have just your screen with, like, let's say you look at an album and you press the play button. And what you want to do is like expand that play button to then fill the entire screen, and inside the play button is where your content shows up. Those kind of transitions are really, really hard to do on the web, and they're annoyingly easy on native. And so people have kind of gotten used to it and even expect that kind of eye candy, and the web just can't provide it. And that's the other motivation behind Houdini, to catch up on that gap in high fidelity visual effects.
So when it comes to these like low-level primitives that you talk about, so these specifications that are part of like the Houdini Suite, I'd like to ask a question about kind of what kind of developers you think will kind of initially pick those up and use those. I suspect it may go in a similar way to kind of what happened with web components, where you've got like the lower-level capability of building components for the web, and you kind of get an initial set of developers kind of experimenting with those specifications and seeing how they work, and then ultimately you get some libraries kind of built on top of those specifications, and then at that point it starts to get kind of wider adoption and more people start using it. Do you think a similar thing will happen with the Houdini specifications, or kind of what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely going to be the same for Houdini, if not more so. So I think one of the, I'm not going to say marketing, but I think one of the miscommunications that happened early with web components is that from the word components and at that point, the rise of React made people think that web components were the same high-level component feature as React components, which is absolutely not true. Like web components are super low level and give you barely anything. So when people looked at it and were like, well, that doesn't help me at all. What is this? And then kind of abandoned it. And that we've been trying, I realized that the web is kind of, or the web people, the browser vendors have been trying to fight that notion for a long time now, that web components are low level primitive and you have to build things on top to reach the same level of abstraction. And basically, it's more or less just a lifecycle callback, really. So with Houdini, I see it happening in a very similar way, especially the more intricate the APIs get, it's going to be extremely hard to just pick them up and do something good with it. It's going to have a learning curve. So my prime example here is the CSS layout API, which allows you to define your own layouts using a Houdini API, which is absolutely great because, for example, one of the things that we've been missing on the web is a good masonry layout, like the Pinterest layout. It usually involves main thread JavaScript and absolute positioning or some weird column hack or something like that. With Houdini, you can actually write a proper layout that is just like a normal display. You just say display masonry layout. Cool. But it's not easy to implement because this API has to implement a proper CSS layout with all the corner cases and edges and weirdness that comes with being a CSS layout. So it's not something that I expect every developer to have in their toolkit. So I don't expect everyone to be able to write CSS modules, Houdini modules, but I do expect almost everyone to pick up off-the-shelf Houdini modules to use them. So I kind of feel like there should be an ecosystem around Houdini at some point where you go to a website and you go, I need a masonry layout and I need a button with a ripple and I need a cool hero transition. And you just get these modules off NPM, load them in your page, and then you have these effects that have been vetted and are like super high performance and do the right thing to make no browser crash or whatever. So it's definitely a power user API. So like you have to know a lot of browser and browser engines to be able to write something. But to use them, you should hopefully be able to just pick them up and drop them in, just like you would a normal library.
It sounds like a great way to also bundle in a lot of that functionality would be using web components as well. Like you mentioned, like a ripple button and having kind of all of that low-level implementation, bundled into a component which you can just drop in, like you said. So I was also going to ask about some like use cases and examples of these different APIs in use. And you've already given like a load of examples already of kind of what you can do with these different APIs. One of my favorites examples, which is I think what you in your talk for Chrome Dev Summit, which was like the squishy box example, that really clicked with me and kind of made it much easier for me to understand kind of what these things are for and kind of what they'll be able to allow us to do. So I don't know whether you could just spend a little bit of time and delve into that squishy box example in a little bit more detail would be really cool.
Yeah, the Chrome Dev Summit talk with the ominous tech problems was a great experience. So the example that you're referring to is the Squircle example. Because currently on the web, you have the option to have a rectangle in form of an element. Set a div, set it to 500 pixels, 500 pixels, make it a red background color. You got a rectangle. If you want round corners, you have border radius. Cool. But then it turns out there's different ways to make the corners of a rectangle round. In this case, you set the radius and you will round off the corners. But then there is a squircle, which is mathematically speaking closer to a circle than a square, but it still looks like a square with rounded corners. And some people might say they find it aesthetically more pleasing. It's, for example, how iOS rounds their home screen icons. That is a squircle. It's not just rounded corners. If you want to have this aesthetic on your website, what do? You kind of end up doing, I guess, a background image once again, maybe a border image, potentially with SVG, but it turns out that you can't just scale a squircle. It doesn't behave quite the same. And how do you change the radius? Different SVG for every different radius. There's just not really a good way to do it. I guess the hackiest version would be you do a canvas and you paint it, and then you turn it into a base 64 image and put that into your element. That's obviously not going to be very performant. And that is where CSS Paint comes in, because Paint decides what your box looks like. The Paint stage paints the actual rectangle on screen. If it has rounded corners, it will paint rounded corners. And if you want to hook in at this stage and say, actually, I know how to paint it, not you, because you don't know about squircles, then the CSS Paint API from Houdini will allow you to write a piece of code that basically defines how to paint these things. And that is one of my, as I said, like an example I brought up in the talk because I really like it myself as well, where you can see that the web doesn't provide a certain capability, squircle-rounded corners, and Houdini allows you to now teach that behavior to the browser and use it like any other form of border radius, just with a little bit of Houdini magic in there.
Yeah, I feel like you get so used to the kind of restrictions that the platform can kind of put in place, as you mentioned there, no squircles. And if you start to think about those kind of capabilities, how different sites and apps could start to look and feel across the web, because even now, even with all the capabilities we have, things tend to look quite similar and have the same kind of geometry and stuff. So having those kind of capabilities kind of break out of that mold a little bit, I think would be super cool, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the side effects that we've been noticing, that there's people try to push the boundaries, but for some reason not necessarily on the UI UX side. For a while now, we have had CSS scroll snap points, which allow you to do these kind of galleries in a way that feels like it is actually part of the operating system. For a while now, we had these galleries on websites which use JavaScript to do the smooth scrolling and snapping. But it always feels a bit alien because you're all used from native apps to a certain physics behavior. But it's never been exposed to you as a web developer, so you kind of had to implement yourself in JavaScript. And now we have CSS scroll snap points, which actually gives you the platform native physics behavior. But people don't do that anymore because they have already stored in the back of their head that, there's only JavaScript, and so I shouldn't be doing these kind of image galleries and carousels because they will always feel alien. None has changed, and now we're like, well, we need to make people aware of the fact that there now actually is a good and performant and native feel way to do that. So this is always kind of this problem where once you give a new capability to the web, that now people need to realize that it is okay to do these things, and especially designers need to go back to actually incorporating these visual effects or these UX features. And that's not an easy problem, actually, as I have found out.
There's a lot of change management involved with just getting rid of those strongly held misconceptions, I would say, because again, you're right. A lot of people have that point in time where, hey, this thing we just couldn't do, so we'll never be able to do it, and then they never sort of revisit that, and then you end up having to do this huge amount of work.
And that carries over to performance as well, because I still see people who, what is it Jake said? Oh yeah, he said that some people still do the array with a join instead of just doing a plus to concatenate strings, because that used to be faster in like IE6. It's not faster anymore, but people still do it. And like, it's been a couple of years. It's really hard to get rid of these old habits, it seems.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's definitely like a lot of education and re-education that like needs to be done. And I think as DevRels, like that's hopefully something that, you guys are focusing on. But I mean, old habits die hard. Think of even just jQuery. We talked about that earlier, like how long it's going to take that project to die, right? It's long time. Even though the original purpose of it was, it's that problem's been solved, right? We're definitely at the point where we have good interoperability between JavaScript engines and browsers as a whole. But anyway, so actually, I wanted to get back to a point that you said earlier, Surma, and I think Leon kind of brought up a great point about how web components can kind of be used in conjunction with Houdini. I guess I think you mentioned that that Houdini is really kind of for power users. But I think I can see kind of having web components be kind of a smooth pill into kind of using some really cool, custom Houdini CSS layouts. I can also see people developing libraries, something similar to like Workbox.js, but for Houdini, right? Where it's like, hey, you want this effect, that effect, here, we've done the complexity, you leverage this and you get the performance benefits and you get the kind of native look and feel. So I guess, do you kind of see things like that happening in the future as the spec kind of matures and gets implemented?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, I think an ecosystem needs to grow around Houdini with like just modules that you can use and that have demos, like a little bit like webcomponents.org, but for Houdini or something like that. I think it would be a really important puzzle piece to have that. And I am working on something in that space. It's February and now I/O is already around the corner again, so I'm kind of need to pace myself. But I am working on kind of having a website where we just collect Houdini modules, and you can contribute your own, or you can just look at other ones, and kind of like a registry. That was another point that I was wanting to make, and now I forgot about it. But yeah, that is definitely an important thing.
Yeah. So I guess like with that in mind, though, I'm curious kind of what the Houdini worker story is, just with the restrictions around web workers and what they can access in the DOM, right? Like, I'm looking at some of the examples just with how you would use Houdini, and it looks really similar to what you do with service workers, right? But yes and no, like in the sense that you're registering, you're saying, hey, random layout, I'm now kind of changing you to do this. And so how does that fit into like being able to, I don't know, I mean, is there kind of like a performance bottleneck with doing too many things with Houdini on one page? I'm just curious kind of if that's something that's an actual issue or not.
So one thing before I go into that more, one important distinction, because you call it workers, in Houdini what we have are worklets, which sounds extraordinarily similar, but it's actually something very different. Or not very different, but it is different. So the thing that you said, like workers don't have access to DOM and all these things, that does not necessarily apply to worklets. So worklets are, the only thing that worklets and workers are in common is that they are isolated in scope. So they are their own little JavaScript execution context. But the big difference is that worklets are don't have an event loop on their own, but are attached to already existing event loops. So for example, the custom layout worklet that is used to do Houdini custom layout is attached to the main thread event loop, and therefore actually has access to the actual DOM. And it makes sense because it needs to. It's doing layout. It needs to access the DOM nodes to be able to lay out them. It needs to read all the styles, and you need to set positions and whatnot. Something like Paint worklet is currently attached to the main thread event loop, mostly for simplicity reasons, because we don't have the plumbing yet. But the stuff that it doesn't actually need access to anything that is usually on the main thread. So we are working on moving that to a completely different thread, meaning that we can actually potentially execute multiple Paint worklets in parallel while the main thread does its usual work when preparing the next frame. So in that sense, and now I can segue over to performance. Houdini is trying to help you have more of a performance budget, so that you can do more without sacrificing as much performance budget on your main thread as you would usually do. That being said, because it is, let's be honest, currently most of the Houdini APIs are Chrome only. The adoption is still fairly low because of that, because we have a couple of polyfills, but of course that doesn't give you any of the performance benefits, just an experience benefits. So we haven't really seen a lot of sites using Houdini excessively and seeing how that impacts performance. My hunch is that it will always be better than the same site written without Houdini, but that is kind of something where we need real life experience. So we have done a couple of laboratory tests, of course, where we always came out with good results. One example is where one part of the Houdini APIs is the typed OM. So you might know that every every DOM element has the .style attribute, where you can access each individual style attributes. You can do style.color, and then you can set the text color. But all of these values are strings. So if you want to access the padding, you get a string with a number and the px for pixels behind it, or whatever unit you were using. And if you wanted to do math with that, you would have to do split the string at the right positions and then convert it to a number, blah, blah, blah. And the typed OM basically gives you a typed interface to the CSS styles. And we have done some laboratory tests where on a very animation-heavy site, converting the JavaScript code that does the animation from old JavaScript to type to M JavaScript gave you an 80% performance boost. Granted, that is an extreme case, and it's a laboratory test, so don't expect that every time you use type to M, your site is going to get 80% faster. But it kind of shows where we set out to go with this, that we wanted to make performance better for the use cases that we see on the web. But to answer your question, we still have to see how Houdini manifests in the real world and what kind of problems people encounter here.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful context. I mean, I was, I'm thinking of this as in terms of the restrictions on workers, right? And I kind of was like, how does workless fit into that? And thank you so much for kind of really getting to the meat of my question around like threading and realms and like just execution context. So I think it's good to know that that's kind of being addressed.
So you just touched on platform support. So could you get a little bit into that as to kind of where people can actually use some of these Houdini APIs? And maybe there's a really handy website to help people figure that out themselves. It'd be great if you could talk about that a little bit. Thanks.
The setup. Some good setup. So I have made a website called ishoudinireadyyet.com where I keep track of which browser has implemented which of the APIs and if they're even interested in doing so. So you can go to that and check that out. Actually, I need to check where we're currently at. So as I said, if we are being honest, the only place where you can actually use Houdini to a visual extent, at least, is Chrome. Safari, interestingly, is the only other browser that has at least partially shipped another API. I don't really count Opera because they just use Blink, but technically Opera has the same API suite that Chrome does. But Safari has partially shipped properties and values, which is an API that allows you to type your custom properties. So the double dash properties in CSS, or CSS variables as they're often called. This API allows you to add types. So you can say this CSS property is actually always a color. And that means if you assign something that is not a CSS color, it will error. And it also allows you to finally animate your custom properties, which is actually kind of huge. So they have shipped parts of those APIs. Lots of other browsers have started development on some of the APIs, or at least signaled interest. But in terms of production, it's only Chrome. And even there, most of it is in Canary still. So in stable, you can use type to M and the Paint API, because that is something that we just found very important for performance reasons on some of our own products. But it's definitely something you can also use as a progressive enhancement, because that's something that I actually looked out for the design of all these APIs, that you can use them as a progressive enhancement and don't have to go all in just to get some new flashy effect. So I'm hoping that we will get more support in 2019. Safari has been surprisingly vocal in that they are developing. So Paint API, they are actually working on. The other ones, the other big ones, so animation worklet and custom layout, we just, at CDS last year, so in November, we just kind of finished animation worklet to go to an origin trial. So even we don't have it in stable, but it's the first time we think it's ready for developers to take a look at. And custom layout was literally completely refactored 2 weeks before Chrome Dev Summit. So all of these are still very much in the making. So it's not surprising that no other browser vendor has put engineering effort behind implementing these APIs yet necessarily. So for now, keep an eye out for Paint API and what you can do with that, because that's probably the first one that's going to be widespread across all different browsers in 2019.
Super. Thank you.
That's cool. So this wouldn't be a podcast with me if I didn't ask about testing. And so I'm curious, what is the testing story for like the Houdini spec? And I guess this kind of goes into the how baked is the spec, right? Are there tests already in web platform tests for it? If so, like, are they ref tests? Like, I guess what kind of tests are they?
There are tests. I'm literally looking it up right now because I think CSS Paint is actually fairly well tested. Yeah, we have 95 tests here. I think those range from argument passing to getting access to the CSS properties to actually painting the right thing and putting it on screen. So that is fairly well tested. I think we have some for animation worklets. Oh, I'm in the wrong folder. Yeah, we have animation worklet tests, but those are obviously much less because we are still just starting to test those. But I have actually, while we were working on making it ready for Chrome Dev Summit, all the bugs I found have been turned into tests. So in terms of at the browser level, we have a couple of tests, a good amount of tests. Yeah, the more stable the API is, and we are keeping working on those to make them more stable. If you're talking about testing as a developer, if I write a Paint worklet, for example, I actually haven't spent much thought about that. I think it's possible, especially if you write them as normal ES6 modules, you can just test them out of band and do like a unit test. But I'm gonna admit that I didn't spend much thought about like proper end-to-end testing as a developer on Houdini just yet.
Cool. So maybe that's like an opportunity for people to contribute to that, kind of through examples. But I guess my question was specific around web platform tests, which just test the interoperability between browsers. But thanks for bringing up the developer unit testing story, because that's a good segue as well.
We have been working a lot on wpt.fyi, so you can just go there and type in animation worklet CSS Paint. I wonder if custom layout is in here, but I doubt it that at this point there's anything in there. So that's like we've been working on this great interface, not just us Chrome, but it's been a cross-browser effort where you can just look at how the web platform tests are doing, and you can see that Paint API, for example, is pretty well tested. So hopefully that means that once the other browsers are done with their implementation, that we will have a very small amount of interoperability issues there.
That's cool.
Out of all of the different specs that are currently as part of like the Houdini Suite, like which is your favorite? Like, what do you think's going to have the biggest impact, or is the most exciting to you? Maybe that's too difficult.
No, it's like it's interesting because I remember at the start I didn't get Paint, and now I think Paint is a super important performance primitive. Then at the start I was super excited about animation worklets, and then it kind of got refactored a couple of times because we couldn't get browsers to agree. So now it's a bit less powerful than it used to be. It's still great, but I feel like the discussion that I witnessed during that entire standards process kind of jaded me a bit. So currently, I'm super excited actually most about, honestly, custom layout, because it has this opportunity to really allow you to take control over not only where things are on the page in terms of layout, but even would allow you technically to make layout animatable. So something that the Flutter people pride themselves on, that they just make their layout engine so fast and so well structured, they can just run layout on every frame, 120 frames a second. So that's in this way, something like a hero transition becomes really easy because you just animate the layout. It doesn't matter. It's cheap enough. And I feel like with custom layout, we're kind of hopefully getting into the same space where, because you know what your page looks like, you don't have to ship or have to use the old CSS block layout that has all the baggage from the 1990s. You don't need collapsing margins. You don't need necessarily a padding, maybe even. You can strip out all these bits from the layout and just make the layout phase so much quicker. It actually becomes feasible to run an animation that causes layout on every frame, and it's still 60 frames a second. So that's something that is just in my head, but something I would love to see somebody prototype, or even I will do it at some point when I get to it. But that would be cool. Like, you can just strip out all the legacy from the web, write your own little layout that is more or less strictly tailored to your website, and it will make the layout phase so much quicker.
That's super cool. So I guess we're almost at the end of our time here today, but I have to ask you this question. It's kind of it's a little bit of a trolley question, which is, are you familiar with the like JS kind of movement? Everything is in JavaScript, right?
Oh, yes.
And so, whether it's your DOM or your CSS, and so what are we kind of? I'm a little concerned around the long-term effects of that as the platform matures, right? I completely understand, like, web engineers are really the most creative problem solvers on earth, and we work in a really hostile environment, and the web's constantly shifting. People just need to get their stuff done. I get it, and they want to do it in a way that's performant. And the platform is definitely not always quick to to kind of implement updates, and so people have their workarounds, right? And so what are we kind of going to do as a community to kind of undo this, I think, a little bit of a mess that we've gotten ourselves into? And, as things like Houdini become more mature, really, it's kind of, there's a lot of things that you're not even going to be able to tap into if all of your CSS is in JavaScript, right? And so I guess, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think let's just all ship more WebAssembly. Done. No, I think there's this misconception that Houdini, or I've heard it on that Houdini is just, it's more JavaScript and less CSS, when it's not really. It's like it's augmenting your CSS with the capabilities that you lack. And for example, the Paint API still needs CSS because, I mean, technically you could do it all in the JavaScript, and then when you want to change a color, you go into your Paint module. But that's not really a reusable Paint module, and the only way to pass parameters to a Paint module is via CSS. So even in that space, you still have to use CSS to customize what your Paint workload is supposed to paint. So it's not like Houdini is trying to abandon CSS and make it all JavaScript, but it's literally an augmentation of the CSS engine with some JavaScript code to give a capability that wasn't there before. But in the grander scheme of things, where we have like CSS and JS and everything in JS, I feel that is just a systemic problem in that we have been working on the web for so long now. We have been carrying the legacy of the web for so long now, which is a document platform, and now people are working apps, and I still don't quite see the web platform itself acknowledging that people want to build apps and not documents. So there's a couple of things on the horizon that are hopefully going to make this a lot better. So it's like the HTML modules thing, and viewport units are also a big change in that regard. HTML template instantiation. A couple of things have been announced and not quite shipped, but are being worked on, that kind of make this leap from going to a document platform more to an app platform. So I think the next 1, 2, 3 years are going to be a massive change for the web, where we will probably afterwards hopefully go back from putting everything in JavaScript to polyfill the things that are not app-like and make the web platform app-like, because by then hopefully the platform will be an actual app platform, and we can focus on building the app rather than evening out the platform to do what we want to do.
That was very prolific. Thank you for such an inspirational answer.
So as we are kind of running up against time, is there anything that we didn't get a chance to ask that you think we should have done, or is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we wrap up?
No, this has been actually fairly covering all the aspects of Houdini. It's been quite fun. I've been recently doing a lot of WebAssembly, which I'm just as enthusiastic about, but that will probably be a whole separate podcast in itself. So I'm gonna not bring that up now. No, I'm really happy that we actually covered all the ups and the downs, which sometimes gets kind of glossed over. So I'm really happy with this.
Well, thank you very much. It's been fascinating learning all about Houdini. It's certainly one of those kind of suite of specifications which, as we've talked about, could really potentially change quite a lot of how we build things, which is really, really exciting, especially, like you said, with WebAssembly, and maybe even more so than what Web Components did for us. So I'm really excited about that. So if people want to get in touch with you on the web, ask you questions, those kind of things, how do people contact you?
I'm on Twitter under Das Surma, and my DMs are always open. So if you have questions, please contact me. You can find most of the Houdini stuff on ishoudiniready.com, where it's also a link to all the demos for all the individual APIs and the GitHub repository and all the things that you hopefully need to know, with articles that I've written on the individual APIs that hopefully are a good introduction. And if not, let me know. And if you run into any problems or questions, feel free to contact me at any time.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Amal, Justin, any final words?
No, this has just been super fun and informative, and thank you for your service to the web platform.
Thanks for having me.
Making it better, and we're really excited to have you back for WebAssembly.
That sounds like
absolutely.
SIMD! All the SIMD things!
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm really excited about SIMD. I just... I saw the tweet the other day, and I just it brought me joy. Yeah, I know it's behind a flag, but you know. All right. Well, this has been episode number 185 of the Web Platform Talk podcast. Today, we've been talking with Surma about Houdini and CSS and all things wonderful web and web platform things. Man, you can do some amazing things now, and it's only getting better. Tune in next week when we talk more things web, more things platform, and all the things that will make your development life just a little bit better. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of your week.